In April 2019, plans by Boris Johnson to introduce an ultra-low emission zone in central London that would add a charge to more polluting vehicles driving in central London were implemented in full by Sadiq Khan. This covered basically the most central parts of the capital in areas where, to be perfectly honest, driving around is way less practical than just taking public transport. In October 2021, Sadiq Khan increased the size of the Ulez to the north and south circular roads to cover broadly what is considered to be more central London, where many people live and work, but still driving isn't the most preferable form of transport given how trafficy it is out on the roads and how useful public transport in these areas really is. Now there are plans to broaden the Ulez even further, all the way out to what is considered to be Greater London by the end of 2023. But what impact will this have on people, on used car prices, and on air quality? How's it going, people? In this video I'll be talking about this much debated topic and hopefully giving you one particularly good reason why the Ulez heading all the way out to the edges of Greater London is a poor move in the immediate term. Please let me know in the comments what your thoughts are, I'd love to hear them. Make sure you hit the like button as well and subscribe as well if you enjoy this kind of content, but without further ado, let's get into the video. So as I mentioned, there are talks about increasing the boundaries of the Ulez to everywhere within Greater London, which is effectively everywhere within the M25 motorway, minus places like Watford etc, which count as Hertfordshire. And as someone who lived in Watford for 15 years, that will be the first time Watfordians will openly be happy to not be included as London. Anywhere within the Ulez would require you to drive a car with a certain emissions standard in order to limit the amount of harmful emissions in the air. If you drive a more polluting car, then it will cost you £12.50 per day to use the car. It's not perfect, but a general rule is anything that's petrol from before 2005 and diesel before 2015. There are three main purposes of this, but I'm only going to focus on one in this video. Those three are air quality, traffic, and the environment. But let's focus specifically on air quality itself, as air quality has significant implications for people's medium and long-term health, including being the leading cause of death for thousands in London every year. Now, thousands of deaths isn't many, but you can't consider it in just deaths. In London, 9,400 premature deaths are attributed to poor air quality every year, which costs between 1.4 and 3.7 billion pounds every year to the health service. In fact, we have the highest air pollution related health costs in Europe. Nitrogen dioxide is the key pollutant from cars that impacts air quality in a way that is dangerous to our health, with bronchitis, asthma, and poor lung formation in children being its most common impacts, but there's also longer term heart and lung problems to be aware of that result from high levels of NO2. The reason why Greater London is now being looked at is basically because the Ulez, among other environmental policies, has significantly decreased the amount of NO2 in the air in London, taking us from being over the recommended limit for 4,000 hours per year to just 100 hours per year after the first Ulez was introduced, which is a reduction of 97%, which is pretty unreal. The idea by making this area bigger then is to continue to decrease the amount of NO2 and other harmful particulates in London air. So this sounds pretty great, right? Making the air better so that we can live healthier lives and decrease the reliance on the NHS to deal with our respiratory problems. Well, yes, that is correct, but with all these things there is a trade-off which has to be balanced. Let me make this very clear, I have little to no skin in the game here. My Polo is Ulez compliant, so even though I live in London, it costs me £0 per day in Ulez fees to drive, and it is my main car for the year, so if the zone went wider, it wouldn't affect me at all. My MX-5 isn't Ulez compliant, but I make the personal choice to bring it into central London for the summer months when I can enjoy it most, and to be honest, I only drive it once a week or so, meaning annually I'll probably pay an absolute maximum of around £200 in Ulez fees, which are literally my own decision. I know Ulez charges exist, I want to drive my nice loud polluting MX-5, I have the money to pay the Ulez charge, so I just drive it around and pay the charges. The problem here is exactly what I just said though. I am fortunate enough to be able to afford the luxury of owning and driving a polluting car in London, where for many, owning and driving a cheap car that is not Ulez compliant isn't a choice, it's literally all they can afford to run. And this is the crux of my argument in this video. I will talk about some more practical pieces as well, but I really really want this theoretical piece to stick with you. People shouldn't be priced in or out of being environmentally conscious, and people shouldn't be able to pay their way out of being environmentally conscious. If you care about the environment and the local London air quality, it shouldn't be a game of, do you have enough money to drive here? It should be a game of, you can only drive here if you have a Ulez compliant car, and if you don't have a Ulez compliant car but need to drive here, then here is the support you need to swap your non-compliant car for a compliant car. Otherwise, you have scumbags like me with a bit of spare money carrying on as usual, fronting a bit of extra cash because it doesn't actually affect them too much, while people who literally can't afford to drive cars that they have for far more reasonable excuses to be driving suffer. This sets a really bad precedent. The rich can pay both to be environmentally conscious and environmentally damaging. The poor can't even afford to be environmentally conscious and get taxed for being environmentally damaging. Now, ahead of the last expansion, there was a scrappage scheme brought in by Sadiq Khan to offer £2,000 to those who needed it most to help buy their Ulez compliant cars as a trade for scrapping their non-compliant cars. There were over 23,000 applications for it and 9,370 acceptances before it ran out of cash, so already that's around 14,000 people who haven't been served. For those 9,370 people, they will be on some kind of government benefits to help them to survive, so I wouldn't assume they'd be having savings outside of the 2k for scrapping their cars, particularly because you'd only logically take the scrappage scheme if you couldn't sell your car for more than £2,000. Now, assume 9,370 Londoners then had £2,000 each to buy a Ulez compliant car. How many are actually available for them to buy? Well, on Auto Trader there are currently 4,614 Ulez compliant cars for sale under £2,000 that are not insurance write-offs. Only 2,700 are within a 100-mile radius of London, which is pretty ridiculously far away to be going to get yourself a new car. So let's say that across all car sales websites there are 5,000 cars available to suit this market. There are still at least 4,000 people with £2,000 in their pocket that can't buy a car for the money they were given, and another 14,000 that didn't even get the 2k in the first place to buy a used car, and a further bunch of people who don't qualify for the scrappage scheme but may still be on low incomes that will want a slice of that same market. Now, I know many people might give up on owning cars entirely, so we'll reduce that demand, but basically what I'm saying is the market of cheap Ulez compliant cars will already have more demand than there is supply, and by increasing the Ulez zone to the edges of Greater London, you only add further demand into that market without increasing any of the supply. So my expectation would be that the Ulez compliant cars continue to increase or maintain their value as they seem to have done in recent times, which is ultimately again worse for those without much money. And with Sadiq suggesting that this will take over 100,000 more non-Ulez compliant cars off the roads around London, that's potentially 100,000 more cars to be replaced. Now, if we just talk about the sub 2k market again, approximately 25% of households in the UK have less than £2,100 saved. If we crudely and inaccurately assume that all of that money is available for car purchasing, then we have a further minimum of 25,000 cars to be replaced within that 2k region, adding on to the 18,000 plus I mentioned before. I could go on to make this picture even more dire, but hopefully you're starting to see that all this will currently do is cause more undue distress to people with less money who might not be able to afford a Ulez compliant car at all, especially if there becomes this much demand for cheap models. Okay, I realise I've gone on a bit about this now, but the final thing I wanted to mention is whether this is really necessary. Sadiq has actually done a great job of reducing NO2 in the air in London, you have to give that to him. But it is now a game of diminishing returns. The Greater London area will capture a total of 2.6 million cars, but theoretically, according to Sadiq, only impact 160,000 non-Ulez vehicles. And while in Greater London people do generally use their cars more often and for more activities than in Central, air pollution levels have always been lower than in Central, shown by the fact that back in 2016, before any Ulez zones came in, pretty much everywhere outside the North and South Circular roads were already meeting the right NO2 levels for their time, at least from what I can see. With everything that's taken place since, the biggest returns have taken place in the most central areas of London, where traffic density is high and polluting cars are no longer there. But these areas were horrendous for air quality and are now much better. Areas that are already not that bad for air quality won't see the same levels of return, particularly if the impact is on such a small number of cars. I've made this video to argue for the most vulnerable in society and to make an ethical point around how everyone should be given the chance to access a Ulez compliant car, therefore negating the pressure that this would place on lower socioeconomic backgrounds in a time where we're in a cost of living crisis that affects them most most prominently. Sadiq has again suggested that we'll have another scrappage scheme and noted that already 11,000 fewer polluting cars entering the new zone every day. That is a win for our personal health, which must be acknowledged. By way of concluding this video, I would urge Sadiq to think of those who can't afford to lose their cars but also won't be able to afford to drive them, and make real steps to ensure they can access Ulez compliant cars. Whether that's a car equivalent of help to buy for those that need it, or increasing grants in this space, something needs to be done, as I doubt, given the complexity and age of London, that in the near to medium term, public transport will be able to effectively ensure everyone can go about their day-to-day lives without cars, particularly within Greater London, where public transport becomes increasingly sparse the further from central you get. I would also urge them to not set a bad precedent of, if you're rich enough to tell the environment to go f itself, you can. If you're not rich enough, sucks to be you. What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear them in the comments down below. Remember to keep it respectful, logical and useful, and maybe then we can have some interesting discussions about this. Don't forget, I've only scratched the surface of this, focusing on the health aspect rather than the environmental and traffic related pieces, so feel free to comment on those. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to hit the like button if you did, and subscribe as well if you're new here. Massive thanks to the patrons as always for their support, and to you guys as well for watching. I'll see you in the next one.